I'm Ernie Manous, and this is Houston Public Media News 88.7, continuing coverage of President Biden's remarks on the situation in Afghanistan. Our experts are here to help unpack the situation in Afghanistan, analyze the president's comments, and discuss the possible consequences of the U.S. withdrawal from that country. What do you think of the president's handling of the situation? Are you a member of the local Afghan community or have family in the country? How are you interpreting these events? We invite you to share your thoughts and comments with us right now at 888-486-9677. That's 888-4-TOWN SQUARE. Joining me right now are Joe Barnes, a former diplomat at the U.S. State Department serving in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. He is also the Bonner Means Baker Fellow at Rice University Baker Institute. Hello there, Mr. Barnes.
Great to see you, Ernie, and please call me Joe.
Okay, Joe. Thank you. Also joining us are Dr. Abdi Javadzadeh, who is from St. Thomas University. He's assistant professor of criminal justice and sociology, an expert on political and sociological theories, international criminology, sociology of terrorism, and Middle East politics. Welcome, Doctor.
Hi, Ernie. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to start with you, Joe. Your reaction to the president's, your initial, I should say, reactions to the president's remarks.
Well, no huge surprises. There was a certain amount of blame shifting going on, perhaps rightly or wrongly, but he cut to the bottom line, at least as far as he's concerned, which is that the collapse of the Afghan government is a price that he is willing to pay to get U.S. troops out of Afghanistan and to end a 20-year-long war. I was particularly impressed by his constant invocation of national interest as a very sort of very clear-eyed look at the U.S. stakes in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Dr. Javadzadeh, your thoughts?
Well, I think, like Joe said, it is not a surprise. I think it's not a surprise even for the past 20 years, that is, since we started the war in Afghanistan. And like the president said, it took us 20 years to learn the hard way that we couldn't just go over to another country and invade it and expect good results in terms of getting rid of either Al-Qaeda or Taliban, insurgency, terrorism, and so forth. So I think this was rather, and this is not a word I'm using on my own. If you listen to the media, not U.S. media necessarily, but maybe all over the world, the word embarrassment comes up a lot. And it feels like it's an embarrassing situation for the U.S. to be there for 20 years, take the Taliban out of power in 2001, 2002, and then sort of hand back power to the Taliban. And from what we've known, these negotiations with the Taliban, even disregarding the Afghani government, has been going on for 4 or 5 years. And that's why I'm not surprised. I've been reading about these negotiations for the past few years, and it's not a big surprise.
Joe, could it have been handled differently? Could we have had a successful withdrawal?
Whenever we withdrew, there would be some bad things happening. Let's do no magic pony thinking here, right? There's not going to be a team of magic ponies that's going to take Joe Biden to a perfect solution in Afghanistan. The collapse of the Afghan government was always a possibility. No matter when we withdrew, I think there is legitimate criticism to be had for the manner in which the Biden has conducted the evacuation or the end of our involvement, which is getting close to the end, although we're still there. I think there is some criticism. Remember, he ran as the president of competence, right? The man of competence compared to Donald J. Trump. And to be honest, there's been more than a whiff of sort of Trumpian incompetence to the way that we managed this withdrawal.
Well, Joe, let me interrupt you here and just say, but how does this happen? how could they, or did they, see this as what was going to happen? And it was like, do we just pull the trigger anyway and let it be? Or did they expect it would be much more graceful of an exit, that people would stay in place and we would withdraw and then things would happen? How does this happen at this level?
Well, look, let me let's do the comparison, the
Okay.
obvious comparison, and the obvious comparison is to Vietnam, right?
Even though they're telling us not to compare it to Vietnam.
No, well, no, none of these hysterical comparisons are perfect,
Okay.
and they can be misleading. But there is one element I think that we can point to. The United States under Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger cut a deal in '73 that led to the withdrawal of American troops. It's pretty clear from materials that both Nixon and Kissinger were far from convinced that the South Vietnamese would survive in perpetuity. The regime would survive. But in Henry Kissinger's famous term, they were hoping for a decent interval, right? And I think that's what Joe Biden wanted, was a decent interval, a matter of months, perhaps even if you're lucky, years, between the withdrawal and the collapse.
Mm-hmm.
In point of fact, they occurred simultaneously. And yeah, I think the Biden administration really, I think they hoped for the best, that there would be some power sharing arrangement, or that the Afghan government would somehow manage to survive. But I think they knew there was an excellent chance it would be a collapse. They just didn't anticipate it would be so quick and comprehensive.
Yeah, I just have trouble understanding how they couldn't see it happening. They knew what was happening in territories. They knew the strength the Taliban had. They knew the support or lack of defense that was against them. That they would have proceeded at this speed without being aware. Doctor, your thoughts?
Well, I also think that, sort of like along what you just said, Ernie, that they knew, and again, I can tell by the process through which this negotiation was taking place. They knew that this will not be a smooth transition. That's really clear. And I'll add to that by saying, when negotiations started, the Taliban specifically asked the U.S. negotiators to not include the Afghani government. That in itself is a sign that we are only, or the U.S. is only dealing with the Taliban. And partially why I would sort of agree with you and say that this cannot be compared to Vietnam is because when the U.S. left Vietnam, Vietnam had a solidified central state that was in control of basically everything. Here today in Afghanistan, you see more chaos, even though the Taliban are trying to take over, even though they're trying to make it look like it's somewhat orderly. What you see in Afghanistan is complete chaos in terms of who is really authority here. There is no central authoritarian like we had in Vietnam. Government left in Afghanistan while that the U.S. troops are leaving. So this is, I think, the biggest difference that there is. And I seriously don't think that we expected. So, the people who were involved in the negotiations, it was the Obama administration, Trump administration, and the Biden administration. While we were negotiating with the Taliban, I truly believe that they did not expect a smooth and mild transition to the new state. They expected what's going on right now today, maybe even worse. But what we're doing right now is trying to put out the fire, and sort of inevitable. Inevitably, this would have happened either way when we were talking about or pulling out the troops, the U.S. troops from Afghanistan.
Joe, let me ask you this then, and you can also comment on what the doctor just said, but what must the conversations have been like with the Afghani president when he was just meeting with our president a couple months ago? What do you think was truthfully being laid out there, and how do you think they parted?
Well, we're going to eventually get about, 500 history books on this, right?
Yeah.
And 20,000 academic papers. I think that uh, I think that it was probably a painful conversation, uh, and we'll have to see the like I said we'll see what historians say about it in the future. Uh, but I think there may well have been a good deal of wishful thinking on both sides,
Hmm.
right? That the Afghan government may have felt that the United States would bail them out at the last minute, and that Joe Biden, from Joe Biden's point of view, that somehow we could get out of this without an immediate collapse. And remember, wishful thinking is one of the most dangerous things you can do in foreign policy.
But what happened to that, as it was said in the president's remarks, the $1 trillion in training that went to building up this military that just seemed to evaporate as this was going on in the country?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on Afghan security forces, but the truth of the matter is that I think everybody was pretty much astonished by the fact that essentially over as little as Taliban had been making advances for a number of years,
Hmm.
but basically the entire Afghan military collapsed in a 14-day period.
Yeah.
I don't know the reasons, but it does suggest that a lot of our investments in building up the Afghan security forces was money ill spent.
I will tell you right now, gentlemen, if you'll hold for a moment, joining us on the phone, activist with the Afghanistan People of Houston, Ahmed, are you there?
Yes, sir, I'm here. How are you?
Pretty good. I'm curious if you could share with me how our local Afghan community is feeling about what's happening, what's the word you're hearing, and what is their reaction to what's going on?
Yes, we're very disappointed what Biden said, the President Biden. He said that he knew that the government of Afghanistan was corrupted. So why would you leave the country to corruptions people like that when you know they wasn't the right leaders? And of course, when they know that he was that type of person, and what Ghazni,
I'm kind of losing you there. Are you still with us, Ahmed?
yes,
There you are.
like he said, no, Ashraf Ghani he disappeared. He know who was Ashraf Ghani exactly. U.S. did know who was the governor and how they was running the Afghanistan government. And how can they leave a leader like that and then leave the country with a leader like that?
Ahmed, I
What
know
about
you.
all those Afghan lives?
Ahmed,
What
I
about
know
all
you
those?
are a single voice in a much larger community, but I'm curious, how do you think we should have exited the country? Or should we have stayed? What's your feelings on this?
I think the right way was if they noticed that the government, the current government that they had in Afghanistan, wasn't doing the right thing for the people of Afghanistan, they should take him out. Because then again, who brought Ashraf Ghani to the politics? U.S. brought him. Who decides who's going to be the president of Afghanistan? U.S. did. Although nobody wanted all these guys that who was the leader, who was working around the leadership in Afghanistan. None of the Afghanistan people chose those people. From
Hmm.
Abdullah to Ashraf Ghani, it wasn't my people choice. Because if it was my people choice, it wouldn't be like that. There was war between my people over there in Afghanistan before Taliban take over, before U.S. Army leave. What was our war in there? How come U.S. didn't notice all that? How come U.S. just ignored all the Afghan people voices? Just walking out like that and led us with the wrong leaders, and what they're gonna have expect, and plus they told our people not to fight. The brave soldiers, they was loaded with ammunition to go for a war, and they said not to go war, not to go war.
Ahmed,
Very
the president made
disappointing.
reference to the fact that the military didn't fight in a sense, the Afghan people themselves did not resist this Taliban takeover. It's a bit of paraphrasing there on my part, but your reaction to that thought?
My reaction is because they was following the leader. The Ashraf Ghani was telling them not to fight. And as a good soldier, I think they had a wrong leader. And even America chose the wrong leader for us.
Before I let you go, last question. I'm curious what you're hearing from the country, if you have family or friends over there. What's the situation like through their eyes right now?
It's a nightmare over there. We don't know what are these Taliban going to do. Are these Taliban the same Taliban that 25 years ago? Or is this a different Taliban? Is this the same Taliban that was coming from ISI of Pakistan, or is it a different Taliban that is going to look out for Afghan government and for Afghan people? This is the question. What kind of Taliban are these now coming? Are they ISI Pakistan Taliban, or this is a Taliban that who's going to do for my country, for our country, the best that my people deserve?
What do you wish for or fear over the next few months?
My people going to be starving, man. My
Yeah.
people will be starving. The innocent will die, and it's just very disappointed at U.S. Government to make such a decision like that.
Mm-hmm. Ahmed, thank you very much for taking the time to chat with us today. And I appreciate your work as an activist and trying to do the best for your people.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Ahmed Sadozi is a local activist for the Afghan people of Houston. We are going to take a quick break. This is Town Square. I'm Ernie Manous. We're talking with Joe Barnes, a former diplomat in the U.S. State Department and a fellow at the Rice University's Baker Institute, and Dr. Javadzadeh at St. Thomas University, where he's an assistant professor. And our phone lines are open to hear from you, 888-486-9677. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll continue with our reaction to the president's comments and what's going on in Afghanistan. This is Town Square. I'm Ernie Manous. We'll be right back. I'm Ernie Manous, and this is Town Square. We're continuing with our reaction to President Biden's comments on Afghanistan and what's happening in that country. Joining me to converse about all of this and to take your questions is Joe Barnes, a former diplomat at the U.S. State Department and a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute, and Dr. Abdi Javadzadeh. I keep slaughtering your name, sir. I apologize for that. Javadzadeh, who is from St. Thomas University. He's the assistant professor over there. And our phone lines are open at 888-486-9677, 888-4-TOWN SQUARE. Joe, let me start with you with this one. The president made reference to the fact that our original goals when we went in were accomplished, basically, the goals we had.
Yeah.
Is that a bit of revisionist history now, or is he accurate on this?
Well, there's a bit of it, like most things in the real world. It's a rather complicated question. Now, look, we did blow the Al Qaeda out of Afghanistan pretty much, and that was our initial goal. But rather rapidly, our mission there developed into nation building, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that may have been the early and perhaps fatal shift in our approach to Afghanistan. So there is some element of truth to what he said, and you'll note, by the way, that in his remarks, Biden stresses that he opposed Obama's surge in Afghanistan in 2009. A lot of people forget it. But the majority of U.S. casualties in Afghanistan occurred under Obama, and particularly during the surge period. So it's a complicated history. But he was, even though he opposed the surge, he was part of an administration that basically continued this expanded mission in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Javadzadeh, I'm curious about who this new Taliban government is. We've heard people referring to them, talking about them. Is it the Taliban we know and remember? Is it I don't even want to use the term new and improved. Is it a different Taliban? Who are they?
That's a really good question. I think Ahmed sort of alluded to it because he was asking, when you asked him a few questions, he was asking, we really don't know who the new Taliban are because people are, like yourself, calling them the new Taliban. And it's been a good it's been since 1996, so 27 or so years, the first time we saw them in power. From the way it looks, so I'm only talking about the surface of things
Hmm.
and what things appear to be, or the way they appear to be. The new Taliban, it seems like it's less ideological. Certainly, in the negotiations, they've agreed to allow women to work and also girls to go to school, and they won't forbid that anymore. They've backed off from the complete covering of women, and they've also agreed not to be as violent as they used to be in terms of the way they used to control people. And I'm talking about in the streets, in public places, and so forth. So seemingly, this is a different Taliban compared to 20, 25, 26 years ago. And it feels like through the negotiations they have sort of agreed. And I'm really waiting for these negotiations to get published at some point. But it seems like they have agreed to not be as heavy-handed as they used to be. Now, the chaos that reigns, that still prevails in Afghanistan, I think has to do with this the sudden giving up of power of the main government in Afghanistan, and so there's a whole lot of organizing that needs to be done. And I think the chaos is this process of the Taliban taking over. And your question, so the short answer to your question is, it feels like this is a different Taliban from 20, 25 years ago.
Joe, on top of that, help me understand. The embassy is closed, our embassy there.
Right.
Does that send a signal that we are not talking with this new government, or does it have to close and a new embassy open when a new government takes control?
Well, right now, most of our embassy personnel are gone, but we do have a residual presence at Kabul airport, right? We are, in fact, talking to the Taliban, I gather, but it's largely at this point about tactical issues related to the airport itself.
Mm-hmm.
The main point is that, as far as I know, we don't have diplomatic relations with the new government of Afghanistan, nor do I anticipate we'll have diplomatic relations in short order. So to that point, the whole question, to that extent, the whole question of having an embassy there is moot.
Yeah. Should we be?
There's such a thing as a formal embassy, and then there's such a thing as these 100 or so U.S. diplomats out at Kabul airport that are still, I think they're mainly involved with processing visas and getting people out.
But should we still have, do you think, diplomatic relations with the Taliban government, or because of the way they've come to power, we need to step back?
Well, I think as a practical matter, I think there's going to be a delay. The key thing is that we're going to have to talk to them one way or the other, and we can do that all sorts of ways. I suspect that we'll be talking to them down in Doha at a minimum, in Doha, Qatar, where there's been negotiations.
Our phone number here is 888-486-9677. We've had some folks hanging on the line that wanted to chat with us about this and give us their thoughts. Robert, you're up first. What's on your mind?
Well, I'm sort of wondering why people aren't looking at this from a historical perspective. I mean, whenever an occupying force leaves the territory, normally odds are it's going to totally collapse. I mean, look at World War One. T.E. Lawrence wanted what occurred, and a Sunni and a Shiite state. Instead, we got the Sykes-Picot geopolitical mess that we're still dealing with today. And when you think about when the British left India, right? We got India in total collapse. Then we had the Pakistan complete, separation and issues that we're still dealing with today. I just, the only thing I could think of historically, and maybe we need to look at this, is maybe the United States is an occupying force in Germany and Japan. But we went in there after a major war, and we went in there with the thought that we were going to pull out very quickly, and we governed as an occupying force, and we set standards. But I mean, I just think that people at least need to step back a little bit and really look at this from a historical perspective and think about what did and didn't work. And very few countries ever came back after an occupying force left. It was total chaos, typically.
Robert, thank you for those points. Let's check with Joe. Joe, your thoughts on Robert's comments?
Well, the whole question of occupation and nation building is a complicated one. Many people point to Japan and Germany as examples of where U.S. military occupation did lead to democracy, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a complicated picture. Both of those were, in point of fact, fairly robust nation states. In fact, they were too nationalistic, as we discovered in World War II. Although much of the country had been destroyed, there was residual state capacity, and moreover, there was an enemy. In both instances, communism, an area where we could find a lot of collaborators, not collaborators in the bad sense, but a lot of partners on the ground in Germany and Japan. And also, in both cases, eventually, we basically opted for a open-ended commitment. And I'm not sure that the American public was ever prepared for an open-ended commitment in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Javadzadeh, the idea of terrorism and that the concept was we were going to stay until we didn't have to fear terrorism from the Taliban. Safe assumption at this point?
Well, it's obviously not, because as we can see, the Taliban has gotten stronger, and I don't just mean militarily. They've been centralized now. And it feels like they have even a wider base in Afghanistan. Anecdotally, I have a student right now who's a Afghanistan war veteran, and I'm sort of interviewing him about what happened in Afghanistan and his thoughts and so forth. And what he at some point in one of these interviews told me was that constantly U.S. troops were outnumbered 3-1. That's his numbers. That's his proportion. 3-1 all the time in relation to the Taliban. So what we called terrorism, and this also has to do with the word that was thrown in a little earlier, that is occupier. I think it was Robert who said it. Occupation, it really depends on whose definition. Terrorism, it really depends on whose definition. Mm-hmm. So while we said we're fighting terrorism in Afghanistan, I visited Afghanistan in 2008. I'm from Iran, so it's just, hop and a skip. And I only stayed there in Kabul a few days, nothing more than that. But I can tell you, people referred to the U.S. troops as occupiers. They didn't call them liberators. They didn't even simply call them American soldiers. They referred to them as occupiers. So going back to what you asked me about terrorism, it's true that in 2011 we actually were able to kill or assassinate Obama, but that's not where terrorism ends. And I think the same forces, and I think Joe mentioned that Al-Qaeda has been, that's not true. Al-Qaeda is still active, and from what we have read, so what we have found out recently, there are actually more members and there are more bases, and they've only learned how to fight better now, both in Pakistan and Afghanistan. It's not just in Afghanistan.
Doctor, let me jump in here for a minute, though, and have you clarify for a lot of our audience who get this confused that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are two separate organizations, but what is their interconnection?
They tactically connected, so they tactically work together. And as well, like you said, maybe a lot of people don't know, I also get this in a lot of my classes, even in my graduate courses, that Taliban and Al-Qaeda are put in the same sort of category, and people think of them as the same people, but the Taliban are mostly Pashtun, and they're from Afghanistan, and a lot of them also speak Persian, which is the other language in Afghanistan, whereas Al-Qaeda members, and Al-Qaeda was actually built in Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Arab countries on the west side of Iran, where Afghanistan is on the east side of Iran, and the Taliban are not the same as Al Qaeda, and they have different agenda. Taliban are basically concentrated on Afghanistan. Even today, when you look at them assume power, what they tell you is we want to establish an Islamic nation in Afghanistan. Whereas Al Qaeda has a different ideology. They're more expansive, and they're talking about regional Islamism rather than just local or national Islamism. So they're ideologically different people, and not the same. So again, we're talking about the Taliban in Afghanistan, and they're concentrated, focused on what's happening in Afghanistan and how they assume power there.
So does the Taliban pose a particular threat to the U.S. as we have perceived Al Qaeda to pose?
I think once Taliban is rest assured that they can take over state apparatus in Afghanistan and they can sort of rule the Islamic way that they want to rule, they will no longer be a threat to the U.S. Whereas that's not true with Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda is not focused on one country. Al Qaeda is regional, and the problems of terrorism in relation to Al Qaeda will still persist.
Joe, your thoughts on all of that?
Well, no, I don't think that I don't think that the Taliban itself represents a threat to the United States at this point. The big question is the extent to which they harbor and cooperate with groups that might want to commit terrorist attacks against the United States.
Mm-hmm. Joe,
and I think Joe Biden made it clear that if we see this going on, we're not going to hesitate to do military strikes against any camps or facilities that we identify.
Joe,
we can do that remotely.
Yeah, Joe, how do you think the Afghan people in Afghanistan took the comments from the president right now?
I don't know. I mean, I just don't have a great sense of that. I doubt that they were much pleased by the extent to which Biden put a lot of the blame on Afghans, and that's a purely natural reaction.
Mm-hmm. Doctor, what about all of the talk of the translators and different folks that have been kind to the U.S. in Afghanistan and now find themselves very vulnerable? What's going to happen there, do you think?
I really have no concrete idea, because we're talking about rescuing them and we're talking about facilitating their transition over to the U.S. and maybe another country. And we are talking about helping them, but I really don't know what specific plans U.S. government has for these allies of the U.S. in Afghanistan. A lot of them feel really like their lives are threatened because during the past 20 years they've become, they were overtly helping the U.S., not covertly. There were some covert operations too, where no one knew who was doing what. People in Afghanistan, but because they were overt and they were helping, they were translating, they were facilitating, whether it was soldiers or private contractors and so forth. They feel like a lot of the Taliban know who they are, and they feel like their lives are threatened. So they're really desperate to want to get out, understandably. But I really don't know what concrete plans we have for them.
Joe, very last question as we're running quickly out of time. How important is it that we handle that situation correctly and getting them out for our future operations globally?
Well, look, this is something that I think really can't be overemphasized. This has both a moral and a practical component. At a moral level, this is simply a debt that we owe, and we should fulfill that we should return the support that we received. More practically, it does make it easier to work with people elsewhere in the world. It gives them at least a modicum of security. I'm talking about places in the world where the situation is unsettled in Afghanistan. But I do believe we have an absolute moral imperative, not just to assist in getting people who helped us out, but in coordinating and cooperating in a broader international effort.
Gentlemen, I've got to cut you off right there. We are definitely out of time. Both of you, thank you very much for joining us. We'll have more coverage of this topic. This is Town Square. I'm Ernie Manous.
Town Square with Ernie Manous is a production of Houston Public Media. The opinions expressed by guests and callers do not necessarily reflect the views of the staff, management, or underwriters of this station. Medical opinions should not replace consultation with a medical professional.